Today I'm going to be speaking with you about A Confederacy of Dunces by John Kennedy Toole. This book satisfied my library's monthly reading prompt, the prompt being a funny book. Because humor is a very subjective thing, and my tastes are very particular, I decided to outsource this one to the vast aggregate of the internet, looking up lists for all-time funniest books. And A Confederacy of Dunces is going to pop up on pretty much every list you come across, for good reason. This is easily among the funniest books I've ever read. It might be the funniest, or at least the one that made me laugh out loud the most. It's incredibly funny. And not funny in a sort of stuffy, timeless way that you would assume given its reverence, that this book won the Pulitzer Prize when it came out. It's actually very accessible, has this really awesome balance of lowbrow and highbrow humor. Before I really pull apart this book and indulge in its exuberant comic delights, I would just encourage that you read it. I think that it deserves its reputation as one of the funniest books ever written. A Confederacy of Dunces was published in 1981, 12 years after the death of its author, John Kennedy Toole, who committed suicide. The myth-making that suicide kind of introduces into the legacy of an artist. I know that there's something about that that is warped and toxic and not healthy to kind of fetishize, but at the same time, a lot of the artists that I find really compelling or have a sort of transgressive voice end up having committed suicide. And this book in particular emerges even among that crowd as something of an oddity. Though there is an element of sadness and destitution to the lives of the characters in this book, it never indulges in it so much that it loses its levity. The experience of reading A Confederacy of Dunces is one that is just so infectiously joyous and uproariously silly. And that's not to say you should not look further into the life that John Kennedy Toole led, as I do think it contextualizes some of the character dynamics of this book, particularly between the protagonist and his mother, as John Kennedy Toole had a strained relationship with his mother, who would eventually go on to publish this book after his death, pleading with people with the means to be able to publish her son's work to give it a chance. The foreword to this book outlines the story of its posthumous publication, and that is also very interesting. As trite an observation as it is to make, there is something compelling to me about an artist who has seen acclaim beyond their own lifespan. That art is a means for an artist to find the success that they never did in their life. Art can be a way of vindicating all that they went through. I think that's a very easy and surface level conclusion to arrive at with a lot of work. It's easy to fetishize artists that committed suicide, but I think everyone who has read this book and enjoyed it can agree that we were really robbed of one of the greatest comic literary voices of our time, the Neon Bible being the only other book he was able to publish in his lifetime, and that was written, I think, when he was in high school. Sure, this book is coated with layers and layers of corrosive irony. So many of the characters in this book are delusional and lack any kind of self-awareness, and thus the humor largely emerges from their own ignorance and narcissism. But John Kennedy Toole, I think, also has an incredibly empathetic feel for all of his deeply flawed and unlikable characters, and so there's this beating heart that you will sense in certain sentences. A Confederacy of Dunces follows the comedic misadventures of one of the greatest protagonists I've encountered in fiction, Ignatius J. Reilly. The entire success of Confederacy of Dunces, I think, could be chalked up to the invention of Riley, one of the funniest imbecilic characters I've ever had the pleasure of reading. He's an unemployed 30-year-old man living in New Orleans being taken care of by his mother. He's a radical who takes umbrage with every facet of society, himself the lone genius in a sea of idiots. Or so he would say, because Ignatius is so totally out of touch with reality. Ignatius has absolutely atrocious social skills. He's incredibly combative, condescending, insulting to pretty much every person he meets, regardless of background or political disposition. He's frequently unleashing the stream of verbal bile upon everyone he encounters in this book, including his mother. He's also quite physically repugnant. He gains weight incrementally throughout the novel after working at a hot dog stand, and he is constantly burping because of his overactive pyloric valve. Even hearing bad news from somebody or an opinion that he doesn't like would close off his pyloric valve, send him into fits of belching and even vomiting. Ignatius is a fascinatingly broken person. John Kennedy Toole has devised like the ultimate unlikable protagonist, and yet in the service of a farce at his expense has devised a perfect comedic hero. And I can see why Ignatius is touted as one of the funniest characters in all of literature, because the amusement we derive from his failures stems from his loquaciousness. He's very verbose, he uses a lot of fun words, he employs them in such a way that gives this grandiose, melodramatic quality to everything he goes through, which is otherwise incredibly mundane and pitiful. Ignatius is a character who will never concede on any front. He will never admit his own shortcomings, admit that anything is his fault. The title of this book is a quote, and I'm paraphrasing here, that whenever a genius emerges in the world, you shall know him, for a confederacy of dunces will emerge to oppose him. Something along the lines of that. And so Ignatius sees the world and everyone in it as a grand conspiracy against him, and is, as a result, unable to take accountability for anything he does. John Kennedy Toole has designed Ignatius's mindset in such a way that he could drop him into any situation with any set of characters and conflict would just naturally happen. There's even a scene where he walks upon these ladies just painting some flowers. They're not doing anything. He just starts arguing with them and insulting them. They don't do anything to him. They're pleading with him, just please leave us alone. We didn't do anything to you. In this fashion, Toole also is able to write conflict in a way that kind of disposes of all of those flimsy bits of escalation that commonly will build to a comedic crescendo, and instead we get scenes that begin at a state of absurd, heightened comedy, and they just flow from there, sometimes building to greater comedic heights than they set out from. But also, Ignatius is not a shallow character. He's really well constructed psychologically, and I think Toole's success as a writer comes from him being able to subtly inject details about how Ignatius came to be this kind of like Arrested Development adult loser, granting him just enough empathetic qualities that we can tolerate Ignatius all throughout the entire book, understanding how a lot of the context of his upbringing, his strangeness, has curdled him into the really sour personality he has become. Toole's achievement in writing dialogue doesn't just stop at Ignatius. The entire cast is filled with these incredibly charismatic, colorful, well-defined comedic side characters who all speak in this particular New Orleans-style dialect, which reflects itself in the writing. When you read Ignatius, he's very well composed and articulate and enunciates all of his words fluently, whereas some characters will speak in almost this kind of slang. You acclimate to this style very quickly. It just flows really well. Literary scholars have often cited a Confederacy of Dunces as being the best representation of this kind of New Orleans dialect, and while part of why this dialogue rings so pristinely to the ears has to be because of Toole's skill as a writer, it also undeniably has to come from his own lived experience. The character of Ignatius, I think, is inspired by one of his old college professors, at least partly. The dialogue is certainly the strongest quality of a Confederacy of Dunces, but it is also a very carefully plotted and well-constructed story that has a very satisfying structure. Chapters are broken up into these kind of like sub-chapters. This structure is deviated from in chapter 12, which is just one continuous comedic crescendo built from previous beats and character arcs that Toole has established throughout the whole story. Chapter 12, deviating from this segmented structure, then follows into chapter 13, which contains a ton of little segments within its one chapter, which conclude a lot of the character arcs in really satisfying, poetic, and ironic ways. The voice of the book rotates between characters outside of their own dialogue, so when a spoken line concludes, it often continues in its description to contain that voice of that character, and pivots from paragraph to paragraph sometimes, depending on the interaction. All of these elements coalesce: the intentional structure, the delectable dialogue, and particular flavor of culture that we experience amounts to a story unlike any I've read before. Not in a really towering way or anything like that, but in a subtle one. The silly situations that Ignatius bumbles into are so numerous that it'll be hard for me not to recount all of them that I love. As zany as this book is, there is a human element that gives the bits dimension, makes them feel as if they don't just exist in this kind of closed off space for a bit to just emerge. You feel the persistent effects of poverty in this novel very acutely. They define everyone's anxieties. Almost all of the conflict in this story emerges from some sort of material basis. The inciting incident, for instance, which is one of the funniest openings to any book I've ever read. Like, if you read this and don't feel compelled to read further, I think that this just simply is not a book for you. But I would say most people are won over from this initial bit where Ignatius's mother drives home drunk from this bar and crashes into this building, and thus they have to pay off this sum of, like, I think almost like over $1,000, which is a lot relative to the time period this was written. Toole illustrates the value of this debt earlier in the chapter. Ignatius's mother sells her hat to a man for $15 so that they can get drinks. Parting with her hat does illustrate the significance of money from the very get-go, before they even incur this ridiculous debt. One of my favorite characters in the book, Burma Jones, is a black man living in the town, and him being paid under the table so pitifully results in him kind of subtly trying to sabotage his employer, this bar. And this plays a crucial part in the climax at the end of the book. The work that Ignatius takes on to pay off his mother's debt comprises the bulk of the narrative, and him being someone who has not held a job while also being incredibly well educated leads to some just ridiculous scenes. Ignatius taking on these odd jobs outlines not just his destitute situation, but the situation of the people who employ him and who he works alongside. And a lot of conflict emerges between Ignatius and his mother over him being unable to pay off this debt, unable to make even more than a quarter every day selling hot dogs. The depiction of these impoverished places never really feels like it's manipulative. It always feels like it's coming from just a really accurate observation about how these environments really are. One of the factories that Ignatius works at for a time is really dilapidated. The factory is being held together by the thinnest of threads. Mr. Gonzalez, the meek office manager, and Miss Trixie, an older woman who the owner of the company, Mr. Levy, his wife, is not letting retire because she's treating her like some kind of project, as if Miss Trixie can't be retired because she still has use and she loves working. Mrs. Levy being completely out of touch with the fact that Miss Trixie just wants to stop working at Levy Pants. She'll do anything. Mrs. Levy is one of the few characters whose narcissism kind of parallels Ignatius's in a certain sense. At one point in the novel, Ignatius writes this horrible letter to one of the business partners of Levy Pants. He ends the letter with, "Yours in anger," just like the cherry on top. He also writes a lot of letters to his rival Myrna Minkoff, someone who's kind of his political opposite, very progressive, very sex positive, kind of an activist, but also just as delusional as he is. So they're kind of a match made in heaven. At the university they attended, the professor goes back through and reads some of the letters that Ignatius wrote to him, and after finishing them, he's just like, oh yeah, that guy. I wonder whatever fucking happened to him. Eventually, Levy Pants gets threatened with a lawsuit from the business partner that Ignatius reached out to. And the threat of that, like this $500,000 lawsuit, also looms over the owner of the company. There's all of these pressures that almost seem absurd and unreasonable put on all of the characters in the book. Except for Ignatius. He seems to get everything he deserves, and on some level probably deserves even more, maybe not abuse, but more consequence for what he does. One of my favorite characters is Patrolman Mancuso, who is just this bumbling, almost like innocent depiction of a cop character who has falsely arrested so many people that his sergeant has kind of punished him by making him go out and patrol the streets in a different costume every day so that he can like go incognito and infiltrate the citizenry to find suspicious characters. This lampooning of authority is present throughout the whole book, at every level really. Patrolman Mancuso is this very earnest character. He just wants to do a good job and support his family, and the really vague assignment the sergeant gives Mancuso to just go out and find suspicious characters should hint to you Toole's feelings about cops and what they actually do or fail to do. Toole skewers pretty much every stereotype of the political spectrum that existed, at least at the time. He lampoons how people were kind of influenced by McCarthyism. This old man that Mrs. Riley is courting, Claude, he can't help but mention the looming threat of communists every time they interact. Myrna Minkoff is this hilarious lampoon of like a left-wing activist, and how the social projects she takes on are really to just kind of feed her own ego. Toole does inject humanity humanity into the people that fall into these groups as well. Mancuso does feel bad for Mrs. Riley and tries his best to help her out of her situation where she just seems like trapped in this house with her son. He tries to give her more prospects and take her bowling and set her up with some new friends. Mr. Levy, who seems to be berated at every front by his wife, who threatens to turn their daughters against him. As wealthy as he is, and as much as he fails to run the business that his father left him, once he finds out that it is Ignatius that has sabotaged the company and has thrust them into this really dire situation, he still feels bad for Ignatius. When somebody does exhibit genuine empathy and care for another character in this book, despite all their ugly qualities, it's very gently moving to me. At the climax of the book, Ignatius rushes out into the street, and Jones saves Ignatius from getting hit by oncoming traffic. And this is entirely despite Jones finding Ignatius totally off-putting. There's this really biting line that Jones throws at him where he's like, hey man, if I had your education, I wouldn't be out here selling people garbage on the street. Jones is probably the most empathetic character, I think, out of the whole bunch. Like, even though his situation is totally shit and it comes from the racist system at the time, because this was written pre-civil rights, even though it was published post-civil rights, he does have empathy for his fellow worker, like Darlene, the dancing girl at the bar, who, once they both get fired together, he feels really bad for. His sabotage ended up in somebody he didn't intend to get hurt getting hurt, somebody who's struggling just like him. And that contrasts with Ignatius, who thinks of himself as enduring the same hardships as Black Americans at the time, even though they get paid less than Miss Trixie, who gets paid far less than Ignatius does. Ignatius is a total lemon. Reading him reminded me a lot of the protagonist of one of my favorite anime of all time, Welcome to the NHK. Someone who is unemployed, kind of a shut-in, and somebody who has this sort of conspiratorial mindset. In a weird way, Ignatius almost feels like a Western hikikomori, someone who is entirely under-socialized. I almost wonder if a director like Todd Solondz would be like perfect for adapting this material to the screen. Definitely worth looking into is the history of the production of this into a movie, which has always failed. Actors like John Candy, John Belushi, they were scheduled to play Ignatius, but died prior to anything really materializing. I haven't seen much of Solond's more renowned work, but I have seen Dark Horse, and the protagonist of that film has just this incredibly off-putting, delusional loser quality that I think parallels the subjects of this book really well. Also, while going through this, I have been watching the FX series adaptation of What We Do in the Shadows, and I could not unhear Matt Berry's particularly pompous delivery in reading Ignatius's lines. I think that if he put on a little bit more weight and shed the British accent a little bit, Matt Berry would be perfect for this role. And for some reason, I don't know why this is, I couldn't help but physically imagine Ignatius as the bomb seller from the Zelda CDI cutscenes, just his incredibly portly physique, his kind of flamboyant attire which he dons when he's working at the hot dog cart. He has to dress up like a pirate. So I have a very particular vision of Ignatius in my mind, and I think you will too. He's just such a well-defined personality. A clever little bit of plotting, along with all of the other stuff that Toole sets up and then pays off, is Ignatius's kind of shrouded past. Why it is that he ended up being the way he is, despite, as a child, being really beloved by his mother. The toxic qualities he took on were adopted as he entered adulthood, and revealed at the end of the book by their neighbor, who is tormented by Ignatius, who is just playing all of these musical instruments in his room right next door to their house. She has to take 7 to 8 ibuprofen a day or something like that. It's just another stupid fucking situation. She reveals that Ignatius's childhood pet Rex dying is kind of what sent him on this spiral, Rex being his closest friend. In the early sections of the book, you encounter this scene where Ignatius remembers the memory of Rex jumping on him, and it gives him an erection, and he begins to masturbate. He masturbates a lot throughout this book. After he gets After he gets hospitalized, his mother comes to visit him, and he notices that he's erect, and so he's like, could you just leave me alone for 5 minutes? So Ignatius has this deviant lust within him, and it's not really defined very clearly. It probably has something to do with animals. His relationship to animals in this book is really funny. Like, he tries to befriend a cat on the street as he's vending his hot dogs, and somebody sees him, just this clear health code violation. He's trying to stuff the cat into the hot dog cart, and it claws him up. And the way that this bird, which is set up as a part of Darlene's act for the bar, the way that that pays off relating to Ignatius is perfect. Though it goes unspoken, I think that it's Ignatius's shame over these sexual desires. It is this attitude that makes Ignatius really bigoted and hostile towards any form of sexual representation. Him going to the movies and being just repulsed by the actresses that he sees on screen is one of the funniest fucking things. Him just like blurting out these criticisms just loudly, full of disdain, annoying everyone else who's seeing the movie with him. In a way, I think Toole was really onto something designing Ignatius this way. I think he represents a lot of archetypes that we're kind of more familiar with nowadays. Ignatius could, I think, fairly be characterized as something of a proto-incel type. Toole predicted the emergence of a very particular kind of failure. There's a scene where Ignatius attends a party trying to rouse the attendees to become his political minions, to enact some form of vague activism as a point of revenge against Myrna Minkoff. But these people just see through him completely and ignore him coldly, and it's kind of sad to read. He's left at this party totally embarrassed and alone and shunned by everyone there, and it evokes the memory of a time when he was in school. He'd repeatedly make mistakes in chemistry class, resulting in explosions, him wetting his pants, which just seemed to me just so sad. I actually didn't really find that bit very funny, and I don't think it's intended to be. I think that it's at this point that Ignatius is truly like at his lowest, most dejected by others. A point of failure so cutting and obvious to him that it actually brings him back to his past feelings of shame and embarrassment that colored his childhood. Probably why his only friend was a dog, and probably why, ironically, it led to him having some very weird sexual desires. As sad and dramatic as all of this might sound, it really is just expressed in these subtle little moments that do stick with me. Most of it really is just populated with Ignatius being a total hilarious buffoon. We get to read writings from his journal too, along with all the letters that he writes. It again, I think, lends Ignatius this literary appeal. He's funny because of how he speaks, how he writes. There's this section around page like 104, 105, I think, where he's writing in his journal trying to condemn the world for its lack of connection with reality, its inability to really see the world for what it is. This is a complete tangent that he's gone off of from the initial point that he's trying to make, and he gets back to his initial point by saying, I've never seen cotton grow before, and I never plan to. Totally unaware that it defeats the entire point he was writing about. Ignatius's beef with Mark Twain is really funny. He like blames Mark Twain for the renown of the Mississippi River. Like, that's something he just really hates about him. There's this one character, George, who comes up to him and wants to buy a hot dog from him, but Ignatius just like looks at him, and just because of the way George looks, he's just so like offended by him that he just refuses to sell him a hot dog. He has to sell these hot dogs, like he's made no money, but just on principle, just on this just like vibe that George gives off, he's just like, no, I'm not gonna sell you a hot dog. Get out of here, you offend me. Oh my god, there's so many other scenes. The story that he's telling these random strangers at the start of the book about how he took a bus trip to Baton Rouge for a job interview, and how he his valve was so agitated that he kept throwing up, and the bus had to stop like 5 times, and it got so bad that the bus driver like got arrested. It's just so funny. And later on in the book, Ignatius calls that bus ride, he calls it like his trip into the heart of darkness. It's so stupid. He's just so ridiculous. Oh man, I love him so much. One of the few cultural icons that Ignatius actually likes is Batman, which I think is testament to his infantilization. And I promise you, going into all of these events doesn't spoil like the great wealth of bits that this book will hold for you. It's hard for me not to repeat myself and say that it is one of the funniest books I've ever read, but it really is. You should absolutely read A Confederacy of Dunces by John Kennedy Toole. It's a book with a lot of heart and an incredible writing style, populated with with tons of memorable characters, some which I didn't even talk about in this review that I can't wait for you to meet yourself. It rewards you on a nearly page-by-page basis. The batting average of this book is astounding. This is a masterpiece. This is like one of my favorite books, and I would really strongly consider rereading it in the future. Given my deadline to meet the prompts for this book club, I really try to find works not only that I can enjoy, but that I can go through pretty quickly and painlessly, that I don't have to labor through mentally, especially after Anathem. That book demanded a lot more of me, and this book was really refreshing in how approachable it was. It filled me with a sense of verve and energy to consume more of it. I think that if it really strikes a chord with you, if you start early in the day, you might be able to finish it in one go. Anyways, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.